Okay, good evening, everybody. This is going to be a very exciting, come on Peter, this is going to be a very exciting and unusual SCI-Arc Wednesday lecture, I should say, event. Tonight is dedicated to the world of sound and sound space. What it even immediately evokes is the question of what is sound and how is sound analyzed, how do you work with sound, scientifically deconstructed, what are the different methodologies of engaging with that material, what is the material, and its various sort of sonic unfoldings in space and experiences in space. Could you turn on the light, please?
We need a little light.
Yeah, we need a little light. Could you turn off the lights just until we start? I think there's also a specific phenomenon, and I don't know if Curtis is going to talk about that, of the perception of sound that completely changes with the luminosity in space and the relation to light. Could you turn up the lights, please?
We want to change our sound perception.
We're going to turn down the lights once we start with the performance, but there's also a technical reason that I prepared a little speech that I haven't studied otherwise. Anyway, so here we are. So we were, looking at those different territories of sound, and we obviously are, or you might be aware of the IRCAM Institute called the Institut Recherche de Coordination Acoustique de Musique at the Pompidou Center in Paris, which in some ways, and I'm sure maybe Curtis will teach us otherwise, is one of the reference places for the research in sound. And it might actually be really interesting to look at least for me it was very interesting, to look at how do they research sound? What are the different research, say, directions from psychoacoustic to, say, more standard understanding of musical acoustics, reverberations, musical structures, and so forth. And there's a whole sort of, say, spectrum of ways to engage with music and sound, which is being researched. But maybe one of the more interesting and the more recent investigations is the one to work with the integration of supercomputers and real-time computation and event sound interaction, which really sort of pushes the engagement with sound and space relations. I don't want to dwell too long on this, but obviously the historical lineage of the critical engagement with music and sound and the interrelation is paralleled with the evolution in the fields of physics and architecture. There are very, very direct relations there. Linking, for instance, just to name the few and obvious that you probably all know, Xenakis and Corbusier's work, but then also Daniel Libeskind's obsession with the violin and the connection, to his passions with Paul Hindemith, operatic music, and his expression of his ideas through chamber works and his architecture that very, very directly are linked to notational properties of understanding and connecting with sound. Not even to talk about the very specific sound investigators like Alvin Luciers to John Cage, and the number, or actually the innumerable series of sound space experimenters. Now, to make a link, or to search for links, I think of particular interest to this audience here at SCI-Arc. I would think too, and you might discover more, aspects of the evolution of sound research and architecture, addressing the integration, obviously, of high-end computation, which we're experiencing in architecture, and the way sound is analyzed, and the way architecture and the generative processes that relate to architectural compositions are connected to research in sound, and I hope we're going to hear and see more of that later tonight, which obviously connects to the computation of signal processing and, as I mentioned, generative algorithms and sound-space interactions in real time. Now, these are all topics curiously congruent and affiliated with the preoccupations that go on right here behind those walls. And I'm very excited to see that later in Curtis's work. Now, to maybe cut my introduction a little bit shorter, tonight, as already mentioned, we have this great pleasure to welcome Curtis Rhodes with his lecture entitled Microcosms of Sounds. His work encompasses the meticulous investigation of the ontology and evolution of electronic music, and the collection of historic artifacts. I guess the two inevitably go together. Beyond his own practice and research, he frequently collaborates with protagonists of new sound and electronic music. His own research very specifically addresses electronic music, composition, decomposition, digital audio signal processing, and the work with algorithmic compositional processes and digital sound. He experiments with granular synthesis of sound that expands into the field of microsound and microtime, researching visualizations and notational principles, and the field of data sonification. You might actually draw, very direct parallels between your work of the investigations of maybe not data sonification, but data objectification, data generative processes that are very directly linked to the conception of bodies. Curtis Rhodes holds a French doctorate from the University of Paris, the 8e, and is professor, vice chair, and PhD graduate advisor at the Media Arts and Technology Institute at UC Santa Barbara. Curtis runs the Center for Research in Electronic Art and Technology at UC Santa Barbara, acronym CREATE, C-R-E-A-T-E. The laboratory researches compositional methodologies and software. It also runs an events program with a concert, as he just explained to me, and a lecture program. Now, having taught at a number of places like the MIT and Harvard, and a number of international institutions, Curtis is well known through his pedagogical and publication work. He is an acclaimed leader in the field of sound research and sound composition and performance. Now, current projects include, and again that links up with SCI-Arc, his work includes a three-dimensional spatialization project in the Iosphere at UC Santa Barbara. And he's invited to SCI-Arc tonight, part of this new concurrent collaboration program between SCI-Arc and the Mediascape Studio, and the very exciting MIT Media Art Technology Laboratory at UC Santa Barbara that we're connected up with this semester, which is known, as you might know, for its amazing, phenomenal facility of the full-scale, full-dimensional, immersive virtual environment. So enough for introduction. Please join me in welcoming Curtis Rhodes to SCI-Arc tonight.
Thank you for that very eloquent introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I'd like to thank Eric Owen Moss, Jean-Michel Crétaz, Wendy Heidemann, Miles Sciotto, and the Student Union for kindly inviting me to SCI-Arc. Yeah, a little bit about my background. I don't think I need to speak that much about it because it's already been given, but I did study composition, electronic music composition at CalArts a long time ago, and then went on to study computer music specifically at the University of California, San Diego. I became editor of Computer Music Journal for the MIT Press for about 20 years, and was a researcher at MIT, etc. I've been at Santa Barbara since 1996, and we founded the Media Arts and Technology program there in 2000. I've written a number of books. One of the recent books is called Microsound. It includes a CD and goes into the aesthetics, the technology of microsound synthesis and processing, and I'll be talking a lot about that tonight. I also released a CD plus DVD called Pointline Cloud in 2005, and I'll be playing some excerpts from that. Currently finishing a book called Composing Electronic Music, which should come out from Oxford University Press in 2010. And this is essentially a book of aesthetics. There's a lot of scientific, technological information that backs up some of my observations, but it's essentially an aesthetic text explaining a lot of what I'm going to be saying tonight, talking about the possibilities, the new possibilities of electronic music. And my textbook, Computer Music Tutorial, has been out since 1996. It's getting a little bit old. We're actually very old. And so I'm working on a revised edition of that for publication in a couple of years. So this talk is a mixture of aesthetic ideas and technical research pursued over the past 5 years in our laboratories. For me, aesthetic reflection, writing, teaching, and research are all related to the process of composition. I'd like to begin by playing the first part of my latest piece, called Touche Pas, dedicated to Mort Sabatnik, who wrote a piece called Touch. So this is Touch Not. Notice in this piece the presence of multiple virtual spaces, and specifically the use of space as a cadence. Electronic music is both a continuation of and a break with traditional musical practice. It shares many things with acoustic music. Indeed, it is possible to compose electronic music with a notation editor such as Sibelius or Finale in a conventionally notated way, in traditional styles, with a result that sounds extremely similar to acoustic performance. And I'd like to play you now an example of this kind of this is pure electronic music, but in a traditional style, shall we say. First, a string quartet by someone you might recognize. Now an orchestra overture. So no acoustic instruments were used to make these performances, and these are not recorded samples. This is pure additive synthesis of sine waves generated by a computer. And anyone can make these sounds with a $479 program called Sinful Orchestra. So if this is electronic music, what is the specificity of the electronic medium? And I'd like to talk about that now. How does today's electronic medium change the rules of the game? And I'd like to briefly point out 9 characteristics that, if we take advantage of them, do change the game. Electronic music opens the domain of composition from a closed, homogeneous set of notes to an unlimited universe of heterogeneous sound objects. Varese called this opening the liberation of sound. The notes of traditional music are a homogeneous system. Each note can be described by the same 4 properties: pitch, dynamic marking, duration, and instrument timbre. A note at a certain pitch, duration, dynamic, and instrument timbre is functionally equivalent to another note with the same properties. The properties of a pair of notes can be compared, and a distance or interval can be measured. The notions of equivalence and distance lead to the concept of invariance, or intervallic distances that are preserved across transformations. By contrast, in the world of all sounds, heterogeneity implies that diverse musical materials may not share common properties. Moreover, in these objects, we allow the possibility of time-varying morphologies and even mutations of identity. We can extend heterogeneity even further down to the level of microsounds within a note, where each constituent grain of sound can be unique. Second, electronic music extends the temporal domain of composition down to the level of microsound, the grains, wavelets, pulsars, grainlets, trainlets, and micro-arcs, among others. Using detailed knowledge about sound, we can edit a microsound until it has just the right timbre, weight, proportion, and shape within a phrase. And I'll talk in a moment about how I define microsound. Electronic instruments unify the time field between the audio or intoned frequencies above 20 hertz and the infrasonic or rhythmic frequencies below this threshold, and we can zoom back and forth so rhythms can morph into tones and vice versa. And I'll play some examples of that in a moment. Sound spatialization has evolved into an integral component of composition. It presents two facets, the virtual and the physical. In the virtual reality of the studio, composers spatialize sounds through techniques that lend the illusion of sounds emerging from imaginary environments. Through convolution, for example, we can take a portrait of an existing space and impose its acoustic signature on any sound. So the way that this portrait is done is to inject some kind of a loud impulse into the space. So that's the acoustic signature of this hall. And if we were to record that, and through the operation of convolution, impose that on any sound, that sound would be heard to be sounding in this space. And this is, it's not a simulation, it's the real thing. You're actually putting that sound through convolution into that space, which is now a virtual space. So there's now, I've been using this technique since 1990, but there's now commercial software that you can buy that gives you real spaces. This is Trinity Church, Boston, and I've this morning spatialized a voice speaking, which I can play you, and put it in that space.
Bacon and eggs, pancetta e uova.
Now the same thing in Trinity Church.
Bacon and eggs, pancetta e uova.
So we do not, the other interesting thing is we don't have to rely on existing spaces. So one way to get one of these signatures or impulse responses is to go into a real physical space, but we can also generate synthetic portraits that correspond to imaginary spaces. And I'd like to suggest an interesting graduate thesis project would be to translate some of these synthetic sound portraits into architectural drawings of the space that could have produced that sound portrait. And I think that would be a very interesting project. As a complement to this virtual approach, in the physical concert hall we see a strong trend toward the use of pluriphonic or multi-loudspeaker sound projection systems around the audience, occupying the entire front stage, positioned vertically, and even within the audience. The convergence of the physical and the virtual makes it possible to paint detailed sonic soundscapes with an interplay between foreground and background elements in 3 dimensions. So this is a portrait of the Acousmonium at the Salle Messiaen, Radio France in Paris. I've had the privilege of distributing my music with the system, and it's a fantastic sound, 80 loudspeakers, different places all around the hall, inside the audience. But new materials and tools mean new organizational strategies. Not only pitch and time, but timbre and space are morphophoric. That is, they're capable of conveying structure. Compositional processes can be based now on timbral mutations, expansion of the concept of counterpoint to include timbral and spatial interplay, detailed control of complex sound masses, juxtapositions of virtual and real soundscapes, sound coalescence, sound disintegration, sound mutation, and interplay between the microtime scale and the other time scales that cannot be realized by acoustic instruments. Fifth, the composer is the performer in the electronic music studio. Let me just finish that. As Varese said, quote, "On an instrument played by a human being, you have to impose a musical thought through notation, Then through notation. Then much later, the player has to prepare himself in various ways to produce what will, one hopes, emerge as that sound. This is also indirect compared to electronics, where you generate something live that can appear and disappear instantly and unpredictably. The notation of electronic music is often graphical rather than symbolic. We see an increasing tendency in music software to portray sound structure graphically. For example, in the sonographic or frequency versus time plane, there's a very interesting program called Metasynth and a number of others in the same category, where you draw the sound, you manipulate an image, and then you listen to it. In some cases, the interface resembles a painting or drawing program for sound, and the representation of sound spectra is increasingly explicit rather than hidden by the note symbol. 7. The frequency precision of the medium opens up new possibilities for pitch organization, such as the unlimited array of microtonal scales, the combination of scales in polytonal construction, and the exploitation of the continuum between pitch and noise. At the same time, dependence on pitch as an organizing principle is reduced due to expanded control over other dimensions. And similarly, the temporal precision of the medium makes it possible to realize mathematically precise rhythmic structures and polyrhythms. At the same time, dependence on the grid of meter, which is necessary in order to synchronize players in instrumental music, is reduced to an optional structuring principle in electronic music. Some people who haven't heard my music before, ask, well, where is the beat? And, I would point out that if you listen to the piece you just heard, there's beating all the time. There's beating, there's repetition, there's pulsation, but it's not always the same. It's emergent. It comes and goes, and it changes. It's sometimes broken. It isn't a constant, fixed, imposed grid that everything has to align to. Finally, memorized control, playback from a stored function or sequence, and algorithmic control, playback according to a set of logical rules, let a composer organize more layers and dimensions than can be handled manually and expand greatly the possibilities of interactive performance. So these possibilities, I claim, change the rules of the game of composition, and the rest of this talk will focus on the areas of microsound and spatialization. My research in this area is based on a scientific model of sound originally proposed by the physicist Denis Gabor in 1946. In Gabor's conception, all sound can be considered as a combination of what he called acoustic quanta or what he called grains. So you can think of, for example, a note lasting one second. And that would be the traditional way to look at it. You'd maybe look at a quarter note at a tempo of 60 that lasts 1 second. But Gabor said, no, we can go further. We can break that down into a series of, let's say, 20 different grains that if you concatenate them together will reconstitute that note. And this is so basically any sound, he posited, could be decomposed into elementary particles and the time scale of these particles is related to the thresholds of perception. So we can now consider today all sound as a combination of elementary grains. Specific to the granular model of sound is to focus on the microsonic timescale between 100 milliseconds, or a tenth of a second, and 1 millisecond, or 1/1000th of a second. As Gabor pointed out, this timescale is of special pertinence to auditory perception, as it corresponds to the range of several auditory difference thresholds. That is, the smallest timescale in which psychoacoustic phenomena such as pitch, timbre, spatial position, and temporal order are still perceptually salient. So let's listen to 3 sound examples. The first is a sequence of 8 grains of 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a second, at random pitches, and it repeats 8 times. So these are long grains, so the pitch melody is quite clear. Now if we reduce the time scale of these grains down to 1 millisecond, which is 1/1000th of a second, you'll notice that quite a change. We cross a perceptual threshold. We no longer hear pitch intervals, but only differences in sound color or timbre. Now that's still a musically useful sound, different timbres pulsing. But if we reduce the duration of the grains still further to 500 microseconds, 500 millionths of a second or 1/2000th of a second, even the sensation of timbre is lost. All the grains sound alike. They're all a click, and the only difference we can hear is the amplitude of the clicks. Thus, these granular thresholds delimit a zone of morphosis where the perceptual quality of the experience changes. And these zones are extremely important in electronic music. For example, the perceptual thresholds between what are perceived as individual events and a continuous stream is of great interest from an aesthetic point of view. Discrete melodies, when speed up, lose their melodic quality and morph into continuous timbres. Rhythms, when sped up, morph into tones. Steering around these thresholds is intrinsically exciting and fascinating. A piece that plays in and around these borders is my composition 10th Vortex. Although it unfolds as a quasi-continuum, one can also hear the continuum break apart at times. In any case, the continuum is full of microsonic articulations, as every grain has been spatially projected to a random point in space. So I'll play this, it's about 3 minutes. As Gabor showed, all sound can be seen as a combination of acoustic particles. The polymath composer, engineer, and architect Xenakis read Gabor's papers and proposed what he called granular synthesis of sound, published in 1960. It's worth noting that this same Xenakis was the designer of the extraordinary Philips Pavilion at the Brussels World's Fair of 1958. The building has been attributed to Le Corbusier, but it's now well known that it was Xenakis' conception. Indeed, the Philips Pavilion is a direct translation into space of the glissandi pitch curves in Xenakis' Metastasis for 61 instruments, a composition that is derived from mathematical algorithms. Of course, in the interior of this extraordinary building were 400 loudspeakers. You can see the loudspeakers scattered stochastically around the interior, again, according to a generative algorithm by Xenakis. In 1972, I had the privilege of attending Xenakis' course on formalized music at Indiana University, and inspired by his vision, I programmed a computer in 1974 to realize granular synthesis for the first time. Today, granular synthesis and analysis models have evolved into a broad range of applied techniques, and my interest in them is twofold. First, music can be seen as a pattern of energy sketched on the canvas of frequency versus time, and granular methods provide a flexible spray jet for the distribution of this energy in terms of sound particles. Using such tools extends the realm of composition down into the internal structure of individual sounds. And second, as Gabor observed, all sound can be viewed as a combination of elementary functions bounded in frequency and time. Through new analysis methods that generate atomic representations, we can visualize and transform sounds in new ways that elucidate and articulate its internal structure. There's not enough time this evening to present all these directions, so I'm going to touch on only a few aspects very quickly. The first is software for the synthesis and transformation of microsound. One of these techniques is called pulsar synthesis, and we have a program called Pulsar Generator on our website that gives a graphical interface. Just play a brief excerpt of some of the sounds it makes. It produces, in one mode, a constant fundamental frequency, which can be, for example, a pulsation. And over that pulsation, we'll hear three formant or peak frequencies in the spectrum that can vary independently. And this is a kind of first. In natural acoustic instruments, the formants are all linked. They have a common destiny. But in this case, they have a rather uncommon destiny. They can each vary independently. One is going down, one is going up. They're also independent in space. So it's one sound, one pulse, but the formants are moving in space and moving up and down independently. In this one, the formants are constant, and it's the fundamental that's varying. Emission control is a recent program developed by David Thal and myself for generalized particle synthesis and sample granulation. Both these programs are downloadable from our website. Granular sampling techniques let a composer stream or scatter acoustic particles in multiple dimensions. So this is a program that takes an existing sound or sample and then granulates it. So I'd just like to play some of the sounds that it produces. First is a spoken voice, and then I'm going to perform some manipulations on that voice.
Mi serve anche dello smalto per le unghie, del rossetto per le labbra, un pezzo di sapone, un pacchetto di sigarette, nient'altro. Mi serve anche dello smalto per le unghie, del rossetto per le labbra, un pezzo di sapone, un pacchetto di sigarette, nient'altro. Mi serve anche dello smalto per le unghie, del rossetto per le labbra, un pezzo di sapone, un pacchetto di sigarette, nient'altro.
How we're going to completely scramble the again, scrambling with smaller grains.
Mi serve anche dello smalto per le unghie, del rossetto per le labbra, un pezzo di sapone, un pacchetto di sigarette, nient'altro.
Now here are some timbral transformations. We begin with an unaltered voice.
La percussion, je trouve, au point de vue essence sonore, a une vitalité que les autres instruments n'ont pas. Il y a d'abord une étendue au point de vue fondamental et partiel que les autres instruments n'ont pas.
Now we change the gender of the voice.
La percussion, je trouve, au point de vue essence sonore, a une vitalité que les autres instruments n'ont pas. Il y a d'abord une étendue au point de vue fondamental et partiel que les autres instruments n'ont pas.
And now we use short grains to make noisy speech.
La percussion, je trouve, au point de vue essence sonore, a une vitalité que les autres instruments n'ont pas. Il y a d'abord une étendue au point de vue fondamental et partiel que les autres instruments n'ont pas.
Let's hear some pitch shifting examples. First, a phrase cut up into grains, pitch shifted 40%.
Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso.
Now more.
Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso. Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso. Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso.
Here are some experiments in granular time stretching and shrinking. First here is Xenakis talking about quantum synthesis.
J'ai pensé à une synthèse de son à base de quanta sonore.
Time stretch by a factor of 2.
J'ai pensé à une synthèse de son à base de quanta sonore.
Now we compress it in time.
J'ai pensé à une synthèse de son à base de quanta sonore.
Here is a formant shifting effect.
Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso.
We shift the formant up.
Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso.
Chipmunk effect.
Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso.
And then going down.
Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso. Ci porti anche una bottiglia di vino rosso.
Another possibility is the idea of processing each one of these grains individually. We can generate hundreds of grains per second, and each one of them can be going through their own processing circuit. So this is an example of putting a filter, individual filter on every grain. Begin with the unadulterated piece, guitar, it's a lute solo.
Ci porti anche una...
Oh, I guess we don't have that, so we'll go on. Since 2004, I've been investigating a new approach to time frequency or spectrum analysis that has been given many names, including atomic decomposition and dictionary-based methods. These can be seen as the analytical counterpart to granular synthesis. And together with my colleague Professor Schinke in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at UCSB, I recently received a grant from the National Science Foundation to investigate and improve these methods. Dictionary-based methods analyze a signal by trying to find matches between the energy in the signal and a predefined dictionary of microsonic grains. So it tries to look at the sound signal and recognize the grains within it from a gigantic dictionary that we have stored in the computer of individual grains. So we see here in this image, the top is the time domain waveform, what you might see in a sound editor. The second image is what this sound looks like in the time frequency domain. So frequency is the vertical axis, time is the horizontal axis, and this is classical Fourier analysis. So we see a kind of blurry image in particular. The next example, notice where the sharp spikes are. It's very blurry in the Fourier representation. The third representation is a so-called wavelet transformation. It has a much better localization of the high frequency energy, but it still is rather blurry throughout the entire sound. And at the bottom is our method, of dictionary-based method, where we have a very good resolution both of time and of frequency. This method is excellent at localizing the energy very precisely. So this is a much finer tooth comb for analyzing any kind of signal. It doesn't have to be audio. So a typical, this technique is especially promising for the analysis of complex audio signals like noises. A typical example of a complex signal is the engine sound of a Ferrari sports car. We were recently asked by the Ferrari concept group in Maranello, Italy, to analyze the sound of their sports cars. I visited their headquarters and toured the factory. Ferraris are designed by scientific method and are physically and sonically modeled prior to any construction, just as if you would model a 747, you want to make sure that it will fly through a modeling process before you put people in it. So they model everything, including the sound of the Ferrari, before anything is built. And they have a very unique production process where the parts generated by computer-driven rapid prototyping machines produce molds for the aluminum parts. So they only make around 300 of each vehicle model, so they can sit at a CAD/CAM machine and generate a new engine part and have it come out, that day and go into production. So this is the Ferrari Enzo, and this is an image of one of the analyses that we did of the Enzo engine sound. Here is that sound. So this is 11 seconds. The car is getting up to 130 miles an hour in this time. So they wanted us, actually it's not anyway, they wanted us in particular to be able to separate out the gearbox rattle from the hum of the engine, and we were able to do that for them. So now I'd like to demonstrate some visualizations we've developed in conjunction with this research, some of which is motivated by scientific aims, others of which are artistically motivated, and some that attempt to satisfy both. This is a visualization, scientific visualization. All of the imagery here is derived scientifically from the sound. So what you'll see is two columns. The left column is the left channel of sound, the right column is the right channel of sound. You'll see a vertical column. Low frequency, bass frequencies are represented at the bottom of the screen, and high treble frequencies are represented at the top of the screen. The energy is very localized in time. It's about 3 minutes. A piece called Half-Life, Sonal Atoms, the first part. example of an artistic visualization is played next by my colleague Brian O'Reilly. Brian is an interesting person. He was a musical assistant at Xenakis' CC Mix Center in Paris. That's where I met him. So he was acting as a musical assistant there. He came to Media Arts and Technology program to finish his master's degree. But he is also, I think, a very talented video artist. And he made these pieces for me based on my music. He's now teaching in Singapore. So this is the first collaboration, a piece called Sculptor. The sound is I granulated a drum track that was sent to me by another one of my former students named John McIntyre of the group Tortoise, and this is my granulation of that fragment that he sent me. So, maybe point out that Brian works in in some ways a similar way to me in that he edits each frame of the video, very micro-oriented. Yeah, this is an example. I'm not not sure I have time to go into all of this, but this is an example of one of the performances that we did at their late grade space, the Recombinant Media Lab in San Francisco in 2006, where we had 16 channels of sound and 10 channels of video. We had, the specific video system was 10 synchronized DVD players, and Brian made a separate video mix for each piece on 10 different DVDs. So it was a rather unique situation where we had 16 channels of sound above you and at ear level, but also then 10 channels of video that was being spatialized. I think this is one of the great possibilities, for example, of a place like the Allosphere, that you don't necessarily always have a seamless environment that you're immersed in, but rather that there are discrete environments that are popping up constantly, and with 500 channels of sound, very many discrete sources as well. It can not only project a continuous surface, but can also then become discrete and differentiated. And of course, as you may have heard about with the Allosphere, we're very interested in the technique of wave field synthesis. This is a sound spatialization method whereby the sound can come for the first time out from the loudspeaker and go into the audience into a specific localized place. And if you're not standing in that place, you will not hear that sound. So I've been asked to propose for a wave field synthesis chandelier in Parma, Italy. This is a veritable cone of silence. If you are standing underneath this chandelier, you will hear a full spectrum of sound. If you're standing outside of that periphery at the bottom, you won't hear anything. So the sound can be projected just at you. Not only that, but when you're standing there, the sound can move anywhere within that vertical space. It can be down below you, at ear level, or above you. So you have this idea of sound coming in, up and down, around your body. There's a close-up view of the system. You need a lot of discrete loudspeakers to reproduce this kind of effect. They're all working to reproduce the same wave front. That's the secret of this technique. So I'd like to conclude this lecture with the second part of the piece I opened up with called Touche Pas, which I completed New Year's Day. The spatial composition on the level of microsound is especially detailed. I think that's an understatement. I'll just leave it at that. To conclude, I'd like to thank my partners in research, Alberto De Campo, Gary Kling, David Thal, Brian O'Reilly, John Schenk, Bob Sturm, and Aaron McLaren. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? I don't know if Curtis would take questions.
Sure.
Do we have any from the audience that would like to address to Curtis?
There's a question.
Yeah. I would like to know how do you organize the sound over time? I understood how you generate the sound, but I didn't see how you, what method do you use to organize it, in time?
Should I use the microphone? Or? Yeah, I use generative techniques on the level of microsound, but in terms of the what I call the meso layer, this is a multi-scale composition, so it's organized on the micro level, at the level of sound objects, at the level of mesostructure or phrases, and also at the macrostructure. So I reserve the use of generative techniques for the synthesis of the sound structure itself. And above that point, I believe the situation becomes too complex for the current generation of generative algorithms. So it since above the sonic level, it is intuitively organized.
Maybe I have a question for you, Doctor. Maybe the Ferrari project makes my point, or at least it sharpens the point I try to make. There is an incredible spatiality and clarity in your composition. I almost feel you can almost feel the structure. You live the structure. It's really phenomenal. Maybe it's also my privilege of sitting up front. I don't know.
I think so.
But that's a world, a space, an experience that is almost inexistent with traditional instrumentation. And I think you also clearly took us through that space. When it comes to the visualizations, referring maybe back to the Ferrari project, there is no need for a screen that would visualize anything that goes on. It's the sound, the object, the experience. And the question I have is, it seems that, let's say, the visualizations that come along with the musical or the sound experiences are harder to link. And I would like to understand more how you connect with those visualizations. Maybe what is the position of those visualizations, what they are meant to do.
Yes.
Because I'm just completely happy with the sound, the space, materiality and sound experience, and the visualizations don't take me any further. So maybe it's my own, misreadings, but I'd like to hear what you think about that.
I can answer that. First of all, we very specifically packaged this set as a DVD and a CD. No visuals on the CD, because I didn't want people to experience this set only on their TV set. And I also wanted people to be able to hear it in their car or without any accompanying visuals. The visuals seem to help some people to break the threshold of the music. When I played this for my mother at 89 years old, watching on the television, oh yeah, I get it. But I think it would have been a little too much for her to hear it just sonically and to appreciate it at the same level. So it's not a necessity, it's an option. And we provide it with this visual experience and without. When we do shows, for example, it's a spectacle to have multiple projectors projecting images while the sound is being spatialized. So it adds a spectacle to the sonic experience. And a lot of people seem to be able to get into it through that door. But these images are to some extent controversial. A lot of people don't like them, but I like them sufficiently to play them when we can.
I was just wondering, do you have a space in mind before you compose these pieces? Is that sort of a forethought, or is that something that sort of emerges from the process you use?
Well, you mean where I'm going to project it?
I mean, just the quality of the pieces are spatial, right? I mean,
yes, very much.
I mean, that's what you get.
It's my studio.
Right.
Yeah, which is acoustically treated and really great loudspeakers and yeah.
So that being the outcome, this spatial experience, do you have that in mind before you compose these things, or is that something that just sort of happened organically through the way you use the algorithm? Right.
I would say that it's an integral part of the process is the spatialization. It's just, and in this piece that you just heard, the last thing, I mean, pitch is there's a bass line even, but it's subservient to a rhythmic, spatial, and timbral game that's being played, dance that's being played. I mean, in the spatial dimension, there are multiple spaces just kind of dancing with one another, and different ones emerge at different times. There's a very tactile point space in the beginning, and then there are pitches are sometimes in the middle range, kind of reverberant bath. And I mentioned before that I use space as a cadence. It's the same function as a cadence. So it's a lot of these phrases end with a big space, like a door just opened. And then we go back close the door, and we're back in a very tight space where stuff is right in your face. So it's part of the game. Yeah. Yes.
I noticed that much of your sound is much about like sonic sculptability. Have you thought of perhaps like taking this sort of sound creation and taking it to a kind of much more traditional composition? When I was hearing your music, I was keep hearing, what would that sound like if it was looping with a certain rhythm, 4x4, or much more of a traditional rhythm and composition. So, because I've heard just about all your composition today, and it seems like it's much more about like sculpting the sound, a sound, rather than a creation of, say, a composed or musical piece.
Well, I think that we have this thing called a remix, and so I would leave that to somebody else to do the remix. But any of this, as I say, anything could be regranulated or remixed, made into something else. So that certainly is a possibility. But I would leave that to others to do. Yes.
I have a couple of different questions, actually several different questions. Thank you for presenting these. Very interesting. I guess if I could ask two questions. One would be, what do you see in relation to the sound as the impact on structure, on impact on living beings, human beings? And then the second question, if I could, is what is driving you when you're exploring? Are you seeing it as a composer of music, or are you seeing it as research into sound, or all of the above? I'm curious what drives you, what's pushing you to explore?
Yeah, well, research and composition have always been part of the same. One leads to the other, and then there's a third component, which is aesthetic reflection. Aesthetic reflection leads to research ideas, which leads to new forms of composition. And reflecting on your compositions leads to new research, which leads to new compositions. So there's a circle there. I'm writing a book, 400 pages, I'm doing research, and I'm composing. So those are all part of the same process. As far as this effect, what is the function of music? The function of music, or of any art, in my opinion, is to sensitize perception, awaken consciousness. I hope that some of you may have heard things here that tweaked your ears a little bit, attuned it a little bit. So my work is very much a perceptual art, I would say. It's all about sensitizing and awake consciousness through perception. that answer your question?
I guess yes and no. I understand what you're saying. The research, exploring, that process. Obviously, that's inherent in, I think, any artist or any person exploring. I was curious with one, if you have a direct connection or correlation with sound on impact on structure on union. And then the other is what specifically is it that drives you? What are you searching for something to achieve, or are you just exploring in the process?
I never had a question like that. Well, it's the process itself that is of interest. It's being a researcher, being in the process of aesthetic reflection, and being a composer. That I guess is what I seek.
Okay, maybe this concludes this evening.